Heidegger starts his work by saying that origin means here that from where and through which a thing is, what it is, and how it is. That which something is as it is we call its nature. The origin of something is the source of its nature. The question of the origin of the artwork asks about the source of its nature. The attitude with which Heidegger approaches the origin of the work of art is exactly the same attitude which can be found in his metaphysics. We could say that there is a certain affinity between this work and Heidegger's other metaphysical works. According to Heidegger, the relation between the artist and the origin of the work is in such a way that the artist is the origin of the work and the work is the origin of the artist. As he is well aware, this forms a circular passage from the artist to the work and from the work back again to the artist. This is because we cannot really understand the work without the artist, and we cannot understand the artist without the work. Each of these contributes to understanding the other in its own turn. However, there is something which is prior to both of these, and that is art itself. They both originate from art. This is the typical metaphysical attitude which he employs throughout his philosophy, and here he is also analyzing art metaphysically. In his What is Metaphysics, he uses the same logic by proposing that the possibility of negation as an act of the intellect and thereby the intellect itself are somehow dependent upon the nothing, and that the not does not originate through negation. Rather, negation is grounded in the not that springs from the annihilation of the nothing. But negation is also only one way of annihilating, that is, only one sort of behavior that has been grounded beforehand in the annihilation of the nothing. Here, the nothing is suggested as something prior to negation in the same way as Heidegger thinks that art is prior to both the artist and the origin of the work. I am merely referring to this metaphysical work of Heidegger in order to show how the concept of art is fundamentally metaphysical for Heidegger. Just as negation is somehow dependent upon the nothing, so is the artist and his work dependent upon art. Only the words change here, not the fundamental logic. Following the same logic, we can analyze what nothing is from examining negation, which Heidegger in fact does. But in order to understand what negation is, we need to understand the nature of the nothing. Likewise, what art is, we should be able to gather from the work. What the work is, we can only find out from the nature of art. Understanding how Heidegger conceives the concept of nothing might help us understand the essay in another crucial way. Heidegger indirectly writes about nothing in his essay. For instance, in general, thing applies to anything that is not simply nothing. A building, a Greek temple, portrays nothing. Does truth then arise out of nothing? Thompson argues that once we recognize the crucial role played by Heidegger's subtly ambiguous use of nothing, we can see that Heidegger's only other major reference to Van Gogh's painting in 1935's The Introduction to Metaphysics again follows the same basic sequence of phenomenological steps. The following is Ian Thompson's example from Heidegger's The Introduction to Metaphysics. A painting by Van Gogh. A pair of rough peasant shoes, nothing else. Actually, the painting represents nothing. But as to what is in that picture, you are immediately alone with it as though you yourself were making your way wearily homeward with your hoe on an evening in late fall after the last potato fires have died down. According to Thompson, when Heidegger states that the picture really represents nothing, he is not advancing the bizarre claim that Van Gogh's painting of a pair of shoes does not represent shoes. Rather, he is suggesting that Van Gogh's painting does more than just represent a pair of shoes. Van Gogh's painting really, properly, or authentically represents the nothing. Indeed, it represents the nothing in a way that ultimately allows us to transcend aesthetic representation from within, by getting us back in touch with the more basic level of human existence that the order of objective representations presupposes but cannot fully recapture. As it can be seen, the origin of the work of art is not the only work in which Heidegger writes about Van Gogh's painting. Heidegger mentions this painting because he believes that it's a good example of a painting which represents nothing, and it is also a painting in which truth can happen. These two concepts, that is, truth and nothing, are recurring themes in Heidegger's philosophy. So when we read that the painting represents nothing, what Heidegger really wants to suggest is not just that the nothing emerges from the ordinary, that the nothing makes itself visible in Van Gogh's painting of an ordinary pair of shoes, but also the reverse, that what we now think of as ordinary first originated out of the nothing through the essential struggle between earth and world. For in Heidegger's view, initially extraordinary creations, once brought into being, eventually become stabilized in intelligibility and so perceived as merely ordinary, in much the same way that what begins as a revealing poetic insight eventually gets routinized into a worn-out cliché. I mentioned that truth and nothing are recurring themes in Heidegger's philosophy. So it's not surprising that there should be a relation between these two concepts for him. For Heidegger, truth is something human and dependent on us. I think this is the influence of Nietzsche on Heidegger, because we can see how he approaches the concept of truth. This influence can be seen in the following passage. If our question, why are there essence rather than nothing, is taken in its full sense, we must avoid singling out any special particular essence, including man. For what indeed is man? Consider the earth within the endless darkness of space in the universe. By way of comparison, it is a tiny grain of sand. Between it and the next grain of its own size there extends a mile or more of emptiness. On the surface of this grain of sand there lives a crawling, bewildered swarm of supposedly intelligent animals who for a moment have discovered knowledge. Here we can see how truth, the nothing, and art are related for Heidegger. This passage is an accurate paraphrase of what Nietzsche writes in his On Truth and Lies in an extramoral sense. Therefore, if there is any truth to be found in art, as Heidegger suggests it is indeed the case, this truth is dependent on us. In the work, when there is a disclosure of the being as what and how it is, there is a happening of truth at work. In the work of art, the truth of the being has set itself to work. The essential nature of art would then be this: the setting itself to work of the truth of beings. We can also note that what he writes in his Nietzsche Volume 1. Art and its works are necessary only as an itinerary and sojourn for man in which the truth of beings as a whole, that is, the unconditioned, the absolute, opens itself up to him. Interestingly enough, Thompson claims that when Heidegger writes that a building, a Greek temple, portrays nothing, or when he writes that in tragedy nothing is staged or displaced theatrically, this should be read in the contrary way. In these cases, the word nothing really does refer to the absence of being. The temple is thus quite different from Van Gogh's painting of the shoes, which for Heidegger really, genuinely or authentically represents the nothing. Indeed, Heidegger seems only to have noticed and developed his own ambiguous use of nothing in the final version of his essay, precisely where it fit with his phenomenological understanding of Van Gogh. Before we could go any further, I need to expand on the concept of truth. We said that in his work on Nietzsche, Heidegger talks about the happening of truth. We find the same trend of thought in his essay, The Origin of the Work of Art. If we want to understand how truth happens in Van Gogh's painting, we need to figure out how this happening of truth is related to the thingly dimension of the artwork. Every work has this thingly character. The reason is because each work needs to be worked upon. We work on the material to create a work of art. Thus, thingliness and creation are inevitably related. This is why Heidegger spends so much effort to talk about thingliness. For Heidegger, what is important is that since the work is something created, the work needs some kind of medium out of which and in which it creates, which entails the thingly element in the work. Without the process of working, there would be no artwork, and in the end result, when the work of art has been created, what appears are the thingly materials out of which the work of art is made. In fact, the thingly is so salient in the artwork that we ought to say the architectural work is in the stone, the wood carving in the wood, the linguistic work in the sound, the work of music in the notes. However, something interesting happens when we talk about the equipments we make out of materials. The work is no more that than the mere thing is a piece of equipment minus the marks of authentic equipmentality, usefulness, and being made. In equipment, the material which we use in making that equipment becomes used and used up. In other words, the material disappears into usefulness. How are the thing, equipment, truth, and the work of art related? Heidegger points out that the equipmentality of equipment consists indeed in its usefulness, but this itself rests in the fullness of an essential being of the equipment. We call this reliability. Nevertheless, as Schurman sees it, usefulness and reliability tell us nothing about its thingly character. A new attitude towards the thing is necessary if we want to know its nature, Heidegger says. He therefore questions the work of art. A pair of peasant shoes enter man's world in order to be worn. They are ordinarily not considered for themselves, but precisely for their usefulness and reliability. When they are worn out, they are thrown away. Even when looked at in a moment's pensive mood, they tell more about the toilsome tread of the worker than about their thingness. Van Gogh has painted such peasant shoes. As a work of art, their usefulness and reliability disappear. Now they are seen for what they are, peasant shoes. The artwork lets us know what shoes are in truth. In the work of art, the truth of a being sets itself to work. What is at work in such a work? The disclosure of a particular being in its being, the happening of truth. This makes clear why Heidegger thinks the artwork let us know what the shoes in truth are. One last remark about truth needs to be made here. Heidegger thinks we normally designate truth to logic and beauty to aesthetics, and as a consequence, art has always been associated with beauty and the beautiful. He challenges this notion when he says that in the work there is a happening of truth at work. He explains what he means a few pages later. In the work, truth is at work. not, that is to say, merely something that is true. The picture which shows the peasant shoes, the poem that says the Roman fountain, does not merely show what these isolated beings as such are, if indeed they show anything at all. Rather, they allow unconcealment with regard to beings as a whole to happen. Beauty is one way in which truth as unconcealment comes to presence. In accordance with this approach to truth, Heidegger expresses his opinion about the failure of science as an original happening of truth. Science is always the cultivation of a domain of truth that has already been opened. On the contrary, the establishment of truth in the work is the bringing forth of a being of a kind which never was before and never will be again. The bringing forth places this being in the open in such a way that what is to be brought forth first clears the openness of the open into which it comes forth. When this bringing forth brings with it specifically the openness of beings, that is truth, that which is brought forth is a work. Bringing forth of this kind is creation.